This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's not long now until their 2021 conference. The theme is Flourishing Animals and it will be held online from the 30th of November to the 2nd of December. Registration is free for members of ASA and you can find out more details on their website. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Lots of the books in the series resonate quite strongly with the kinds of themes we'll be exploring in today's episode. For example, one of the series' first books, published back in 2015, was Animals in the Anthropocene, Critical Perspectives on Non-Human Futures. This was edited by the Human Animal Research Network editorial collective and includes chapters by a number of authors who'll be familiar to regular listeners of Knowing Animals. But on to today's episode. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Kadri Aavik. Kadri is an Associate Professor of Gender Studies in the School of Governance, Law and Society at Talinn University in Estonia. She works on gender studies, especially critical studies on men and masculinities, critical animal studies and vegan studies. Today we're going to talk about her paper Vegan Men, Towards Greater Care for Non-Human Others, Earth and Self, which appeared in Men, Masculinities and Earth, a collection edited by Pulé and Martin Hultman and published by Palgrave Macmillan earlier this year. This paper was part of a wider project of Kadri's called Climate Sustainability in the Kitchen, Everyday Food Cultures in Transition, which she undertook at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Welcome to the podcast, Kadri.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I know that this paper is part of a wider research project you've been undertaking. Could you introduce us to this wider project and how this paper fits into it?
Right. As you mentioned, there's this research project at the University of Helsinki, which is called Climate Sustainability in the Kitchen and Everyday Food Cultures in Transition. And so this is a project that's been ongoing since 2018. And so it actually focuses on studying cultural change towards more sustainable ways of living and relating to other beings. And the theme that we particularly focus on is really food and kind of like how we can develop more like climate sustainable ways of eating and that are also, considerate of non-human animals. And so that we are a small team of researchers who are doing mainly academic research on this theme. But I should also mention that there's a kind of practical part in the project, which actually involved creating vegan recipes. And they are kind of recipes that have a very low as low as possible climate impact, and that they are targeted at kind of large kitchens in Finland. So to kind of really, it's as part of critical animal studies, we feel like there should be a very practical impact as well. So not just like theoretical writing about this issue. So this is where my study fits in, and each of us is working kind of on a different topic, somewhat different topic. I've been interested, and my main kind of field of studies is gender studies, and I've been focusing on men and masculinities in particular. And then, so this is on the one hand, and on the other hand, I've been a vegan for a very long time, and also a vegan activist, animal activist, and I decided to kind of bring these values and interests and knowledge together, and I decided to focus on vegan men. And kind of like why I did that, I could say too, is that, from a gender perspective, it's been kind of talked about a lot how many of men's practices and masculine values are kind of damaging for sustainability, for the environment and animals. And so men's environmental footprint is higher compared to women and to other genders. And also men consume more meat, as we know. So actually, overall, men have been viewed as this like monolithic group who are responsible for a lot of the negative effects of climate change. But I kind of like thought, okay, maybe there could be some groups of men who could be looked at as kind of agents of positive change. And I thought that vegan men could be, that they have kind of that potential. And so I started to look at links between men, masculinities, and veganism, and really I was interested to see the potential that vegan men have for challenging some of these damaging patterns through their vegan praxis. So actually looking at these men as a positive example, so in which men can contribute to social and environmental sustainability.
Now, I noticed that in the chapter, you conceptualize veganism as a kind of protest or a kind of activism, but also as a chance to do masculinity differently. So I hope you don't mind me kind of starting with the basics. What do you understand veganism to be?
Yeah, so there have been a number of definitions that I've come across, and I'm still sort of thinking that through, and always considering like what would be the best way to conceptualize it, the more useful way. And yeah, there's a lot of like talk about maybe more in the mainstream media how veganism is just a diet, or lifestyle or things like that. And for me, yes, definitely veganism is that too, but it's kind of limiting, and I think it's much more than that. So I kind of in my research try to understand veganism as a kind of form of everyday activism or microactivism in a way that people do in their everyday settings in everyday lives, and that kind of helps to arrive at maybe some kind of change, but not as an individual practice. It can be sort of maybe more micro change, but there's always the question, what the kind of institutional change can follow from that. So there's always that tension. But yeah, so I kind of look at it more maybe as a microactivism. I think that's a kind of useful way of thinking about it.
Another element of veganism that you mentioned in passing when you're setting up the kind of parameters of your study is the link between veganism and urban lifestyles. I thought that was really interesting. Could you explain that?
The kind of like talk about, men and men's practices and how they are damaging to the environment. And there's this like calls for men to kind of return to nature in a way, or in quotation marks, nature, I guess, and then connect to nature. And I think in a way, maybe that could be also a bit limiting, because many of us live in these very urban contexts, and then of course there's nature in urban areas as well. We're not like completely cut off, but in a way, like there should be some ways in which we can extend or show care towards non-human others and the earth, and our surroundings, also in ways that don't involve, going and living in a forest in a way, because that's really untenable for many of us these days. And also this kind of idea that actually veganism helps us to connect to non-human animals and extend care towards them in a way that doesn't involve, necessarily direct contact with those non-human animals. So in a way, we are able to, care about their lives and address some of those environmental issues that come from animal farming and other social issues that are related to this huge, large-scale animal exploitation in a way that we do not, move back to the forest, and we don't necessarily have direct contact with the animals.
Now, this research is based upon interviews with vegans in Finland and vegans in Estonia. Now, that was very interesting to me because the context of Finland and Estonia is perhaps quite different to the context of many Western European or other Western European or North American countries where vegans are studied. So could you introduce us to the place of veganism in Finland and Estonia and the particular challenges, if any, that vegans may face in these countries?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And one of the reasons why I chose to study vegan men in these contexts, besides the fact that I'm, from Estonia and I'm kind of familiar with the Estonian and Finnish context, is that these geographical and social contexts haven't been really studied in the context of men and veganism. So there's a lot of definitely similarities to when you think about veganism, let's say in the UK or US or some other Western countries, but also maybe like there could be some distinct elements. So definitely eating meat and eating animals is still a part of traditional kind of masculinity in these places, certainly. And the kind of like, I should make a distinction too a little bit between Estonia and Finland, because Estonia is a kind of newer democracy, and kind of access to veganism and vegan eating and kind of the whole idea of veganism was much kind of later, like it happened later in Estonia than in Finland. So there hasn't been that much time kind of in Estonia to develop in a way veganism, although I think we have caught up pretty well. And also the distinction perhaps is that in Finland, there's a much longer history of like the social justice movement in other gender issues and other issues. And in Estonia, it's much more recent. So I think there's a link between those things. So I think veganism connects to and builds on a lot of those other issues in a way. But in terms of kind of availability of vegan products, I think both countries are really very well comparable to, I guess, the UK, other Western European countries. So can't really complain. Like if one is interested in all these new diverse vegan products, there's all these things are available. And perhaps maybe one thing I thought could be that in terms of the climate, it's pretty cold, and there are these cold winters. And then maybe one argument that men or others, everyone really faces is like, how can you be vegan in this very, very cold and harsh climate? And don't you need, meat or other like animal products to kind of live well or not be cold in a way? So I think maybe that's a kind of other kind of pressure that some vegans might be facing.
So I think I'm right in saying that all of your interviewees made the switch to veganism as teenagers or as adults. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about why and how they made the switch?
That's right. Yes, they switched when they were teenagers or adults. There was nobody who had been vegan since childhood or so. And well, the reasons were really different. And as you can imagine, all these kind of three main reasons were represented. So there were these health reasons, environmental reasons, and animal rights reasons, definitely. And it was kind of typical for one of those reasons, or perhaps two, but more likely one to be a primary reason why they switched, And then it was really common that after some time, or at least at the time of the interviews, they said that more than one or all of those reasons are important to them. Like that's why they are vegans currently. And it was typical for them to be, start from one aspect and then to be immersed in all this information. Like very typical way was to just Google and to read books or look at videos about veganism, about animal rights. And then they kind of learned so much that they kind of said that, this kind of opened their eyes. It was a very common expression used that, they kind of started to become very critical about some mainstream information about animals. Yeah, so actually most of them had more than one reason than why they were vegans, even those who were studied with health reasons only.
Do you think that there's anything distinctive about the way that men transition to veganism or are motivated towards veganism in contrast to women and non-binary people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I have to say, because I haven't studied women's veganism or veganism of other genders and non-binary people, then I really maybe can't say that well. And that's also something that I feel like I need to study a little bit more. There is a lot of material. I should say that I had 61 kind of in-depth interviews. So there's a lot of aspects that I'm still covering there. But yeah, so I'm thinking, so the transition, if you think of the reasons or what kind of made them transition, I guess there were several different reasons, but there was this one, maybe if I had to summarize or give like an overall kind of reason, then there was this kind of idea that, or feeling given that there should be some kind of change in their lives, in how they relate to either their own selves, their bodies, their health, or to the environment or to animals. So kind of this idea that like I need to have a life that is more, in accordance with how I feel or some of my new beliefs that I'm merging. So that was kind of really common. And then like how they got there was really like looking at a lot of kind of maybe coming across one piece of information that then led to another or something. And in some cases, yes, there was this kind of like influence of particularly female partner that they mentioned that, experience such experiences like, the female partner becoming vegan and started cooking, vegan food at home. And then they felt that they needed to respect that and went along with that. So there was that too. But yeah, so I'm not sure how distinct that is from women or non-binary people's experiences.
Yes, well, one of the things you were saying there, and I underlined this when I was reading the text, you said that the men overwhelmingly highlighted the emergence of a more positive sense of self coming out of their transition to veganism. And that sounded like a really positive message.
Yes, so that was actually something that I encountered in really almost all the experiences or the narratives of the men. It was really, veganism was described as a good choice, or even by some as the best decision they made in their lives. Like it was considered in their biographies like a huge turning point, a really important like transition, and something like that made their lives better, the way they felt about themselves and their own lives. So for some, maybe it was this idea that first starting with their own health, that they simply felt better in their bodies. So that was one aspect. And then also it was really common to say that, so now I'm feeling so much better about myself because I'm doing the right thing, or I'm living in accordance with my beliefs, and I'm kind of living in a way that I don't participate in doing harm to animals. So I think this kind of positive sense of self came very much from that, and that was very interesting because that really it was typical that this kind of positive sense of self came from this idea of care, like towards animals. And now, like, I'm caring about them and kind of doing something practical so that they wouldn't be like harmed. So I thought that was a really significant finding.
Yes, definitely. Especially as this idea of care is so often tied to femininity and to women's reasons for changing their lifestyle and going vegan. I mean, another aspect of what you drew out of the interviews that is often tied to femininity is the emotional aspect of veganism.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about one interviewee who experienced anger, but then you talked about another who stressed the need for vegans to show compassion and empathy towards non-vegans.
Yes. So then that's also like a very interesting aspect that I'm still kind of also studying. And then this was in this chapter that we're talking about. I just, I guess, touched upon it quite briefly. But yes, I could say that emotions really played a role there. And men kind of talked about the various emotions that they felt upon going vegan. And one really was this kind of disbelief or anger when they kind of encountered this reality. They understood, they learned, they got information about animal exploitation, factory farms by watching video clips or something. So there were some of these stories of how they cried, or like how they had this very emotional, affective, and like this very strong kind of responses to that. And it was like described in some cases that there was, this initial anger that, I'm kind of angry towards and really disappointed in my fellow human beings. What are they doing here? But then as kind of like that kind of these feelings kind of subsided, or they, after some years at least, they felt like, okay, so that's the reality. And now, like, what can I do? When they were more like, as this one interviewee was really kind of saying, that we kind of need to, despite what we kind of feel inside about it, we need to be kind of compassionate towards the other side too. And kind of otherwise we have no chance in like getting other people to care about animals and influencing them towards veganism or something like that. So definitely, I think it's really interesting. And this is from a gender point of view, all these feelings. I mean, anger is kind of a masculine emotion as well. It's coded as masculine, So I think that was quite interesting. But yeah, there were all these like other emotions too that they felt, and this sense of like compassion and kind of talking about how, I became a better human being, and kind of my veganism transformed me in positive ways was a core message, I guess.
Now, this is a chapter in a book about ecological masculinities. Could you explain what ecological masculinities are and how veganism ties to this?
Mm-hmm. All right. So yes, so this book is on ecological masculinities, and it's edited by Pulé and Martin Hultman, who actually wrote like a previous book on explaining that concept as well. So ecological masculinities briefly means like masculine ideals and men's practices that are geared towards like more sustainability, and that involves ecological sustainability as well as social sustainability, and kind of like combining those aspects. So gender equality actually is really important there. So it's not enough if men are just kind of more eco-friendly in their practices and values, but it's kind of that social dimension is very much present, and it's kind of they are interlinked. And I think vegan men's kind of lives and practices really fit in there very well, because as I argue too, they kind of offer us like a very concrete way of how to do this ecological masculinity in a way. So veganism involves, giving up animal products and not supporting those massively polluting industries, as well as an industry that does so much damage and causes suffering to non-human animals. So on the one hand that, and on the other hand, and this is a little bit, it's not so straightforward, but like what is the kind of link between vegan men's veganism and kind of gender equality and maybe intersectional justice as well more broadly. And I think, as I try to also argue, and I'm kind of working on this issue currently, I think vegan men have some potential to foster greater gender equality, but also there are perhaps it's not that straightforward. It doesn't mean that if you're a vegan man that you're automatically like helping to achieve gender equality or you're concerned about broader social justice issues.
Yes, and right in the closing pages of the chapter, you actually quoted one of your interviewees who explicitly separates a call for animal justice, gender justice, ecological justice, and so on from veganism, saying it's a thing that would alienate men from veganism. Do you think he has a point?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting finding, and I did actually find that there were some men who explicitly linked their veganism and their animal rights views to this broader social justice agenda. Like they were concerned about gender inequalities, about racial justice, different things, And this was particularly was seen among some men in Finland, where I said, there's been a longer tradition of all those things in the society, so it's easier perhaps for men to align with those things. And I guess in Estonia, it was more like I wouldn't say there was like opposition to that, but yes, there were maybe more of those positions where men didn't explicitly link those things. And as you noted, one of them even said that we should keep them separate. And I think he was really here, maybe not even referring to his own views so much, but was thinking about how he comes across if he in the society, if he associates those things. And in a way, when you think about the context where you are kind of situated, definitely Estonia compared to Finland has much more gender inequalities in the society, and there's kind of social justice is promoted, but still is definitely there's so much room for improvement here. And in this context, it could be that perhaps you will alienate some people in a way. But my personal point of view is like, I think that shouldn't be a reason for us to drop those other things. I definitely would want to see veganism and animal rights as part of this broader social justice agenda. And I think what I call, it's a term, intersectional coalitions, that I have used also in my other work. I think these are really important if we are to strive towards a more equal world.
Yes, and just speaking specifically about the Estonian and Finnish context, one of the elements in this intersectional coalition is the pacifist movement. And I was very interested that you talked about how many of these vegan men had refused military service.
Yes, that was so. Just as a bit of context, so in both Estonia and Finland, military service is compulsory for men. That's a kind of issue of masculinity too that I tried to explore in the interviews, and actually it came up as a kind of just randomly in some interviews, and I started to ask about it, and I found out that in Finland particularly, again, there was this group of men who said that they refused the military service because it went against their kind of ideas about gender and kind of social justice. And this was a way for them to signify that they are kind of different from other men, and they kind of have had different views and values from quite early on, because men go into military service normally when they are 18 or 19. So when they kind of talked about the vegan transition, it was mentioned, that I refused military service. And in Estonia, I think there was just, I can't really do statistics here because it was qualitative research, but we spoke with one man who had done this alternative service. You can go and do something else too, like usually it's a care work in a way, which is also very feminized. But I think, again, in Finland, there's a kind of stronger tradition of and it's easier perhaps to kind of say no to that kind of thing.
Now, Kadri, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I think I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, it was actually Carol Adams's Sexual Politics of Meat, which was very transformative for me.
Absolutely, and it's one of the most common answers we get to that question.
I imagine, and I used to be, before reading that, I used to be a vegan and I used to be a feminist, and then I became a vegan feminist, so I learned to link those things.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, so it was a co-authored article with another Estonian vegan feminist in 2015 in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, and we explored the question as to why and how many mainstream feminists actually support speciesism.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Okay, this would be a bit difficult, but I would say the US-based critical animal studies scholar Vasil Stanescu. I've been really inspired by his work on the kind of myth of the humane and meat and sustainable local meat, and this idea of also that he's challenging the idea of lab meat. So really inspirational work.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, I think not eat them, and also to find ways to really explicitly challenge animal exploitation through their own research.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would end factory farming.
And what are you working on next?
Currently, in this climate kitchen project, we are working on a book which is titled Developing Feminist Animal Studies, Critical Perspectives on Food and Eating. And it will hopefully be out next year in the Brill Critical Animal Studies series. And I will have a chapter in the book on the issue of how men's veganism links with actually gender and intersectional justice.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Well, I'm on ResearchGate and academia.edu, and I've posted my work there. So that's a good place. And you could also check Google Climate Sustainability in the Kitchen at the University of Helsinki website, where you'll find information about this project as well as our publications. And also just by Googling me, I guess.
Well, thanks, Kadri, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.